My grandparents on my father's side are Margaret Ina Larsen, originally Margaret Ina Sutherland, and Neil Webster Larsen. My grandmother's roots are in Scotland and my grandfather's in Denmark. Both families have very interesting and very different history. Let's start on my grandfather's side over 125 years ago. My great-grandparents Henry and Mary Larsen married and first moved to the New World in 1883, settling in Omaha, USA. While residing in Omaha, Mary gave birth to 3 of their children, Thorvald, William, and my great-grandfather Arthur. In the fall of 1902, a number of men in Omaha, seeing that the future of wage workers in Omaha was none too rosy, decided to pull their stakes and try to make it in the homesteads in Western Canada. Here, they could obtain land grants of 160 acres so long as they were profitable in their first few years, which was a huge pull factor. In consultation with a Canadian government agent based in Omaha, they decided to settle in what was then the territory of Alberta. A tract of land 22 miles from Innisfail was set aside for the settlement, which was eventually named Dixon. Henry and his brother Jim were the ones chosen to go scope out the land. When they arrived midwinter, they were amazed at the sight of cattle grazing on grass growing through the ice. Cattle raising was seen as one of the quickest and easiest ways to make a living, so obviously they decided to go through with it. That June, 4 families made the trek up to settle. When they arrived, however, they discovered that what they had thought to be luscious grassland had actually been a swamp, 4 feet deep in some places, on which they were unable to settle without it being drained. By mid-July, they were able to pitch their tents and start to build houses. Original houses were made of logs with sod roofs. Enough houses were built by winter to hold the whole community, 17 in all. More and more people started to arrive, and by 1906 the population was 76. In 1910, a horrific hailstorm came through and flattened almost all of the crops. There is still evidence of this today, as some of the tree bark has been peeled off. After school, Art became a spokesperson for farming equipment who traveled from farm to farm promoting his machines. On one of the farms, he met Olivia Jensen, who was born in Denmark but was now helping out on a farm in the nearby town of Stannard, Alberta. They married in 1921 and had 2 sons, one of which was my grandfather. The family lived in Calgary, Alberta, where Neil would eventually meet my grandmother. On my grandmother's side, the roots lead us back to the Orkney Islands on the north tip of Scotland. This is where my great-great-grandparents, Andrew Laird Sutherland and Margaret Stanger, met and married. They spent their early married life in Edinburgh, the capital of the country, where Andrew worked as a tram driver. In 1906, they gave birth to my great-grandfather Andy Sutherland. He was the only surviving child of the 5 that were born. This was one of their push factors. The family wanted to escape the tragedy of their lost children in their home country. In 1912, the family took up roots and moved to the Orkney district in the province of Alberta, where Margaret's family had already been living for 4 years. The fact that they had family living in the area was a big pull factor. Also, the family was looking for a better quality of life, and in Canada, they could receive very cheap land. The family homesteaded on the northeast quarter of section 53021 west of 4th. They later received the northwest quarter of section 53021-4. Of this half section, about 1/4 section was cultivated. Their farm was principally a grain farm, but they also owned a couple of cattle, and of course chickens. In 1914, they had a bad yield of grain, and Andrew had to find work driving the Munson Ferry. It also snowed a lot in the new land, and sometimes snow was up over their windows. In early years, Margaret had to travel all the way to Munson to trade, as the Orkney Road leading to Drumheller had not yet been constructed. Andy went to school full-time until June 1920, when he had finished grade 8. The year after, he went part-time. In 1924, Andy went off to Tech in Calgary, where he took a course in tractor maintenance. Upon his return, he operated the Quance IHC Titan tractor. In 1926, the family bought the Fred Kerr's farm, consisting of the southwest quarter of section 93021 and the southwest quarter of section 83021, which was originally Hudson's Bay land. Between the two, about 280 acres were cultivated. By the time the Great Depression hit, the family was already fairly well off, but it still affected them. It was harder to grow their crops, and they did not get as good of a yield. Although the times were tough, the family still had some great moments. In 1936, Andy became engaged to Lillian Brass, and they married in Scotland in 1937. They returned as a family in 1938. Little more than a year later, they gave birth to my grandmother, Margaret Ina Sutherland. The day of her birth was July 11th, 1939. 3 years later, they had a second child, Carol, born Christmas Day, 1942. Then in another 7 years, Doreen was born on the last day of August. In 1949, Andy was diagnosed with cancer and passed away just 5 months later in March 1950. 3 years after that, the family sold the farm to the man who had been helping out while Andy was sick. In 1953, they moved to Calgary to live the rest of their life. On May 21st, 1960, the two separate families were joined when my grandmother and grandfather got married. They had 2 children, Darren, who's my dad, and Carrie Lynn. Darren was born on the 22nd of May, 1965, and Carrie Lynn was born on the 6th of January, 1967. On June 10th, 1994, my dad married my mom, Janet Morse, which led to me being born on May 27th, 1998. Without everything that happened 100 years ago, I would never have existed, and that is my place in Canadian history.